Okay, thank you so much everyone for joining us for the webinar. A couple of things before we get started. I wanted to ask everyone to please keep your videos turned off throughout the webinar. And if you have questions or things like that, please use the chat box that's available. We will be recording today's webinar and we'll be making it available on the website. So here I have the slide up that gives you the website for the National Research Collaborative for Foster Alumni in Higher Ed. So if you'd like to check out our website, then the website is www.nrc-fahe.org. And I just wanted to, before we get started on today's webinar, I just want to, oh, and one other thing. I know some of you are joining us by phone, so you don't have the option of typing into the chat box. So if you are joining us by phone and you have questions, please send me those by email. My email is amy.salazar@wsu.edu. So that's amy.salazar@wsu.edu. I just wanted to do a quick mention of our next our March webinar. So our next webinar is Tuesday, March 12th. It'll be noon to 1 Pacific time or 3 to 4 Eastern time. And our next presenter will be Eunice Matthews Armstead. She's a professor of social work at Eastern Connecticut State University. And her presentation entitled Hidden Treasures, Exploring the Needs of Foster Youth in Higher Education will share the results of a focus group and some individual interviews that she conducted with foster care alumni students that explored what students felt contributed to their success and what they thought they needed. She'll also talk about the design of a pilot program on her campus. So if you haven't already registered for that and you're interested, please do. You can register on the NRC-FAHE website, or you can email me as well if you're having trouble finding the registration link. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of information about how today's webinar will go, our presenter, Jacob Gross, will have about 35 minutes for his presentation, and then we'll open it up to about 15 minutes or so for Q&A time. So if you wouldn't mind holding your questions to the end, or you could go ahead and type them in the chat box if you want to, but we'll come back to those after Jacob has completed his presentation. Okay, so I think that is everything. And Jacob, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, let me get my screen shared here. All right, Amy, can you see that okay?
Yes.
My slide's perfect. Excellent. Thank you everyone for attending today. I'm very excited to share with you all some work that's near and dear to my heart. It's some exploratory work. It's relatively new stuff that I'm coming out with, and this is kind of a new area for me. Just briefly, a little bit about my background. So I'm an associate professor of higher education administration here at the University of Louisville. I have, up to this point in my career, really focused on policies that impact access and success for historically underrepresented students. And basically, I'm interested in what helps these students get into and through college. And I've looked mostly at financial aid. And I'm going to talk a little bit more, just a few minutes here, about why I think financial aid is really important for all students, but particularly for former foster youth. Here at the University of Louisville, I also direct the Center for Economic Education, which you'll see some of that will come into play when I pose questions and potential ideas for action here at the end. I have to say, I feel like a bit of an interloper, especially I think with the group of you all that are attending this webinar. I do not have any training in the field of social work, and I've never even taken a human development class. So I really approach this as someone who has a lot to learn about how to help former foster youth get into and through higher education and foster youth and former foster youth in general. I was a foster parent for a number of years, and that was in part what piqued my interest in looking at former foster youth. So I'm going to give you a bit of a roadmap and where we are going to head today in the time that we have together. First, I think it's important to make the case for so what. Why are we looking at financial aid for former foster youth? Why are we doing a webinar on this? It's either before lunch for a number of you or just after lunch. And financial aid is not always the sexiest, I think, of topics in terms of policies for youth and students in higher education. So I'm going to talk about the so what. I'm going to hit on some of the key takeaways at the beginning. The most important things I think I hope that you walk away from this webinar with. And then I'm really going to sort of get into the core of the presentation. I'm going to first orient you to what I did and then present some of the information on students, former foster youth, economic and financial backgrounds, financial behaviors, who applied for aid, who didn't, what kind of aid did they receive, and some indicators of affordability. Now, I want to start out with a few kind of notes or caveats here. If you're not in the field of higher education, I think it's important to note that you're probably going to hear me use some terms interchangeably. I'm going to use higher education, college, and probably at times post-secondary education interchangeably. It's important to point out when I'm using those terms that there are just over 7,700 institutions of post-secondary education in the United States. So anything above the secondary level is what I'm considering to be post-secondary education. So it's a really diverse industry. It's really a diverse field. So I also want to just say a quick note about my use of terminology, because I think this is important. I think the language we use to talk about foster care and foster youth and youth who have experienced care is really important. I think it's a matter of, it's not just a matter of academic debate, but really these labels have a lot of power to shape perspectives and ascribe meaning and influence perspectives. I'm choosing to use the term former foster youth to convey that I'm referring to adults who were in the foster care system, but that lived experience in foster care may be profoundly impactful still for those adults. And importantly, when I'm talking about former foster youth, I'm trying to focus on the characteristics that are associated with adults who have been in foster care, such as maybe lower levels of academic preparation or higher incidence of mental health issues, but I'm looking at and thinking about these things in terms of the environment and context, and not necessarily as intrinsic characteristics of these individuals. So in all of this, I'm really going to be thinking and talking about systemic barriers, policies, contextual issues here in terms of affordability. And then I'm going to wrap up here with this, well, as Dr. Salazar said, some questions from you all. So what? So why focus on financial aid for former foster youth? Well, I think as we all are aware of, former foster youth have educational aspirations that are as high as peers who have not experienced foster care, who've never been in the foster care system. Yet outcomes can be substantially and are substantially different for youth who have been in care. And I presented some of the information here. I think one of the most stark or impactful statistics is that if you look at and compare former foster youth to low-income and first-generation students, this comes from Opickett and Courtney's 2018 study, they found that 6 years after enrolling, 28% of low-income and first-generation students completed a college degree compared to just under 12% of former foster youth. Both completion rates are very low compared to national averages. Former foster youth are much, much lower. So why does financial aid matter? We know that former foster youth face significant and profound impacts from being in the foster care system often, that there are significant barriers to college enrollment, including lower levels of academic preparation on average. This can come from being moved from school to school, perhaps less support from former foster parents due to lack of role clarity. Former foster youth tend to enroll in secondary schools, with fewer resources and lower levels of performance. There are barriers to college success. If a student does get into college, those lower levels of academic preparation at the high school level, can continue to impact them in terms of the amount of time it takes them to get through post-secondary education and whether or not they are able to even complete post-secondary education. So I'll say there's substantive and systemic issues to address. So why look at financial aid? Well, I'm taking the perspective here that financial aid is necessary but not sufficient condition for student success, right? So my perspective is that we have to take money off the table as much as possible. But of course, money is intertwined with a lot of other things that impact student success. But I think it's important because I would argue that in terms of the systemic barriers, right, in terms of looking at individual experiences and behaviors and health and institutional context and institutional operations and societal changes that would need to be affected, I would argue that financial aid is a relatively low-hanging fruit to address from a policy perspective. So that's why I want to focus on it today. So I'm usually not a fan of doing webinars or taking webinars because I find it can be easy, especially if you're taking them to be distracted by emails or text or whatever. So I'm going to really invite people to stay engaged here for about another 20 or so minutes in terms of the presentation, and then really engage one another in the conversation. But if you are, have things going on or have something that that's going to have to make you pop out from this, I just want to give you some of the key takeaways. And I invite you to think about these as I'm walking through some of the information, some of the data. I invite you to think about these two things and ask yourself questions about what's going on here, what's at play, and more importantly, what can we do about these? So the first key takeaway, this is probably not surprising to many of you, but affordability may be a barrier for former foster youth, regardless of whether they attend less expensive institutions, and that former foster youth pay more to attend college as a percent of their income than all their other peer groups. So affordability here is a concern. It's key takeaway number one. Second key takeaway from this webinar is that former foster youth appear to be less likely to apply for student financial aid, despite high likelihood of eligibility. So just to orient you quickly to what I did and to jump into some of the information, some of the data. I'm starting here with a pretty, I think, basic descriptive question, but one that I think is important. How do former foster youth finance their higher education? And I wanted to do this at a national level, and I thought that was important because although there are increasingly a lot of really good studies out there looking at post-secondary access and success of former foster youth, in most cases, those are limited to regional or institutional samples. So I really wanted to get something at the national level here and something that was really sort of at the 50,000 foot level. So you're not going to learn a lot from this webinar about the lived experiences of former foster youth in terms of how they pay for higher education. Nonetheless, I think this provides some really important context for beginning to ask those deeper questions. So to do this, I've used a national sample from the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study. It's called NPSAS. That is done every 4 years by the U.S. Department of Education. It provides a wealth of information about how students pay for college and their financial behaviors. For the purposes of the question that I'm addressing here, I wanted to look at all undergraduate students, so first year through fifth year students that enrolled in 2015, 2016. And just for your reference here, so former foster youth represented about 6.2% of all students in that sample. And again, this is a nationally representative sample of students. Now, a challenge with these data and a challenge in looking at or trying to draw conclusions at a national level with former foster youth is that identifying former foster youth and getting good data on who was in foster care is challenging to do. And so what I'm using and what is used in NIPSAS is good old question 53 from the FAFSA. And it's there at the bottom of your screen. And this question asks, at any time since you turned age 13, were both your parents deceased, were you in foster care, or were you a dependent or ward of the court? So stop and think about your own expertise working with this population. Think about your experiences with foster care system. And I think you will quickly identify some limitations with that question. Two, just to point out briefly, is I am not able to discern which students who responded yes to this question were in foster care since age 13, or which responded yes to the other criteria. They were dependent or ward of the court if their parents were deceased. Also, substantively speaking, I'm not sure what the difference is between a student who would have answered yes to that question at age 12 versus 13. Perhaps there are differences. I have yet to be able to find why the federal government has set 13 as that age. But it's not entirely clear to me why age 13 is the cutoff. Nonetheless, this is one of the best ways we have to identify former foster youth at a national level. And I will say NIPSAS 16, the National Center for Education Statistics that runs this survey, made a deliberate effort to collect better data about former foster youth. So what they did is when they surveyed the students, those that did not complete a FAFSA, they surveyed and asked them if they had, they asked them this question here, question 53. Okay, now we're about to get into some of the tables and some of the information that I've gleaned from this data set. But I just want to orient you all, especially for those of you that are going to be looking at these tables visually. I'm going to orient you to what I'm about to show you. And I'm going to describe this too, so for folks that are on the phone. So in doing this and looking at this question of how former foster youth pay for college, I'm comparing former foster youth, again, those that answered yes to that question, question 53, to students who were first generation or low income, and then students, what I define as other or classify as other students, so students who were not first generation or low income, and students who were not former foster youth. It's important to use these two groups to compare former foster youth because there are some characteristics that former foster youth and first generation or low income students have in common. And then those other students really sort of provide us with a baseline of student experiences. Briefly, as we go through these tables, I will point out what I think are the interesting findings. But especially if you're watching this presentation, you'll denote these subscripts A, B, or C. That just tells you if there's a statistically significant difference across the cells in that row. Will make more sense when I show some of these tables, I think. So first, it's important as we're going through this to keep in mind that 46% of former foster youth enrolled in a 2-year institution or a community college. And that matters for at least 3 reasons. First, community colleges tend to have fewer financial resources to support their students. On average, they tend to have fewer financial resources to support students, both in the forms of financial aid to students and in terms of the resources they have to provide student support services like counseling or academic advising as an example of academic support services. So that's one reason it matters. Community colleges tend to have fewer resources to support their students. Secondly, it matters because some work, specifically that done by Jennifer Geiger, has looked at these campus-based support programs that specifically work with former foster youth. And Geiger and her colleagues' initial work has suggested that the majority of those programs, in one of her studies, she found 68% of respondents worked at four-year institutions. So the majority of the campus-based support programs may exist at four-year institutions. Of course, there are notable exceptions like the Great Expectation programs in Virginia, but this is something interesting, I think important to keep in mind in terms of where former foster youth go and where the support services may be. And then thirdly, why this matters, that former foster youth go to community colleges in somewhat greater proportion, is that community colleges tend to cost less. So attending a community college is a cost-saving behavior on the part of students, perhaps. We will note, though, however, that 43% of former foster youth do go to a four-year institution. And also I found it interesting that 8% of former foster youth attended more than one institution. So looking a little bit at the socioeconomic background here, particularly the income level amongst these three groups, a few things to point out here. So the first statistic or number here I want to talk about is income as a percent of poverty level. Now this takes into account household size and locale. So whether or not the student, for example, lived in Hawaii, Alaska, District of Columbia, they're going to have different poverty guidelines. But so this number represents income as a percent of poverty level. A value of 100 would indicate that the student is living at the poverty level. A value below 100 indicates that the student is living below the poverty level. And then, of course, over 100 indicates they're living above the poverty level. So there are some, perhaps not surprising, but what I think important and stark differences here. So former foster youth, 67% income percent of poverty level compared to 72% for low income or first generation students and 313% of other students. So again, this is the median here, right? You have concentration of former foster youth are living below the poverty level. If you look at adjusted gross incomes, there are dramatic differences here. The median AGI for former foster youth was around $13,000. For low-income or first-generation students, it was around $16,000. And for that other category of students, it was around $66,000. And briefly here, in parentheses, we have the standard deviations. And all I really want to point out here is that you'll see the number, the standard deviation is smaller for former foster youth, which means there's a greater concentration of former foster youth at that AGI level. So in other words, former foster youth are more concentrated in terms of poverty. The last thing I want to point out here is the percentile ranks, income percentile ranks for students. Now it's interesting, right? So I just said that former foster youth have lower median incomes than the other comparison groups, yet they have higher income percentile ranks than the other comparison groups. And I haven't really dug into this data point, but I would hypothesize that what's going on here is that former foster youth tend to enroll in institutions that overall have a greater concentration of economically poor students. So just briefly, some information about banking behaviors and credit card usage. I think the takeaway from this slide is that overall, there actually aren't a lot of differences between former foster youth and their banking behaviors. That is whether or not they had a checking or savings account, and their credit card usage. The main difference we see here is one I've highlighted, which is a lower proportion of former foster youth have a checking or savings account. So it's 86% of former foster youth have a checking or savings account compared to 93% of other students. But if you look at some of these other characteristics here in terms of, for example, credit card usage, you see a 4 percentage point difference between former foster youth and other students in terms of former foster youth being more likely to have more than one credit card. But you see relatively similar proportions here in terms of former foster youth in the comparison groups using credit cards to pay for tuition and fees. So as part of this survey, students were asked questions about their awareness of how to repay their student loans and then some basic questions about financial literacy. Now, for those of you that don't work in financial aid or aren't aware of these different loan programs, there are different methods that the federal government lays out for all of us to pay back our loans. These include income contingent or income driven. So what you pay is proportional to what you make in terms of your student loan. And then there are also student loan forgiveness programs. Someone like me who's been a public servant for over a decade, if I meet certain income criteria, I'm eligible to have a proportion of my federal loans forgiven. We see what I would describe statistically significant differences, but not substantively significant differences among former foster youth in terms, among the comparison groups in terms of their awareness about income-driven student loan repayment plans. So for example, 33% of former foster youth said they were aware of income-driven student loan repayment programs compared to 32.9% of other students. Again, here we see that about 35% of former foster youth said they were aware of student loan forgiveness programs compared to 35% of low-income or first-generation students and 37% of other students. Now, briefly, there's some questions about financial literacy. Financial literacy pertain to concepts such as saving, earning income, time value of money, use of credit, etc. Financial literacy appeared to be somewhat lower. We're talking, though, less than 2 percentage points among former foster youth and first-generation students compared to other students. I will point out that the proportions that I'm putting up here, that all of the comparison groups, including former foster youth, their answers, the number of correct answers to financial literacy corrections are about on par with national averages with financial literacy studies from the general population. Okay, so this is what I would think of as one of the more important findings, one of the more important slides here, is who applied for aid, who didn't, and what were their stated reasons for not applying for aid. So 32.3% of former foster youth did not apply for any aid. That's almost twice the proportion of low-income or first-generation students and 13 percentage points more than other students. So let me just reiterate that point. 32.3% of former foster youth did not apply for any form of financial aid. The primary reason stated for not applying for aid among former foster youth was that 55.3% said they didn't think they'd be eligible. That compares with 47.7% of other students. So perceived ineligibility was the most common reason all students did not apply for financial aid, but it was a greater reason for former foster youth. Also, a slightly higher proportion of former foster youth, 16.1%, said that they did not have information about how to apply for financial aid compared to 13.6% of low-income or first-generation students. So just let this sink in for just a minute here, right? And recall that median income that I showed earlier. So the median income I showed earlier was just, for former foster youth, was just over $13,000. Now, generally speaking, students who themselves or their families earned $50,000 or less annually will tend to qualify for a Pell Grant. Of course, there are exceptions, but generally if you're under $50,000, you're going to qualify for a Pell Grant. And the median income of former foster youth in this sample was $13,000. And just to note, the median income for any student in this sample who received a Pell Grant was $21,750. Now, I would guess most folks are familiar with Pell Grants, but if you're not, that is the primary need-based grant program run by the federal government. And I'll talk more about that, but that's a really important source of financial aid for students. A few things to point out briefly in terms of the amount of aid students received by type. So overall, we see that former foster youth on average, receive less aid than their peers. In the case of other students, it was about $3,300 less per year for going to school. If you look at Pell Grants, you will see that, so first of all, if we look at grants, we see that grants are the primary single largest source of aid for all students, but for former foster youth, Pell Grants made up about half of their total grant aids. All that to say is that grants are really important to former foster youth, and Pell Grants are particularly important. And then the last thing I want to point out is merit aid. There's substantial difference in the amount, on average, of merit aid that students received. Students who were former foster youth received about $850 in merit aid, and other students received about $2,000. Substantial difference there. Excuse me. Two quick things to point out on this slide. So we found that nearly 1/3 of former foster youth did not apply for any form of financial aid, but among those who did not apply for, found that 1/3 of former foster youth did not apply for aid, and that 40%, however, of former foster youth received no aid. Now that could be for reasons including not filling out the form correctly, or being selected for verification of their form and not following up on that. I'm not entirely sure why those students weren't receiving aid, but 40% of former foster youth did not receive any form of financial aid compared to 28% of other students. And the other thing I'll point out is that former foster youth, not surprisingly, given that they tend to come from lower income backgrounds economically, were more debt averse than their peers. So about 3.2% of former foster youth took out loans only, compared to about 9.2% of others. So I've talked about former foster youth not applying for receiving aid, but I wanted to disaggregate those numbers by institutional level just a bit to see if differences existed, because as I said before, community colleges tend to have less aid to give students. So this is a proportion of students receiving no aid by institutional level. And as expected, a lower proportion of former foster youth at two-year institutions received any form of aid compared to former foster youth at four-year institutions. This is not surprising, but it does show us that it is this former foster youth at the community colleges that are driving some of those numbers that we saw around not receiving aid. And so finally here, to begin kind of wrapping some of this up and moving toward conclusions, I talked before about affordability. I made the point that affordability appears to be a concern for former foster youth. And I think this slide illustrates that really well. So this is the net price of attendance after grants, right? So this is what students have to pay after all that grant aid that we saw in the earlier slides is applied to their cost of attendance as a percent of their income. So for former foster youth who attended four-year institutions, they would have to pay 77% of their income after grants to attend that institution. That compares with 30% of other students also at four-year institutions. At two-year institutions, it was 65% of income for former foster youth compared to 23% of income for other students. So I want to let that sink in for a moment. Think about that in terms of affordability. Having to pay 77% or 65% of your income after grants to attend college. So briefly, what are the main findings here? Well, as I pointed out, that former foster youth are more likely than their peers to live below the poverty level. They're more likely to enroll in community colleges, which tend to have fewer resources on average to support students. Some financial behaviors appear to be similar, but former foster youth were less likely to have a savings or checking account. Former foster youth, more so than their peer groups, did not apply for financial aid, primarily because they didn't think they were eligible. Former foster youth receive less in aid overall than their peers and are more reliant on grants. And finally, as illustrated in that last slide, former foster youth pay a higher proportion of their income to attend college at any level, at all levels, compared to peers. So I was going to wrap this up, and as I was thinking about recommendations, but I'm not sure I'm at a recommendations stage. So I've sort of phrased this as questions/ideas for action, and these are really intended to prompt some conversation and maybe some questions. And I'm hoping you all can help me make some sense of all of this and ask some good questions to help drive this work forward. But first, I'm really intrigued by this finding that former foster youth were less likely to apply for financial aid. And that raises the question about whether or not former foster youth have access to the information they need. Now, we know from prior research in the field that families are really important for getting students the information they need to know how to apply for college. There's some work by Bill Tierney, Kristen Venegas, a few years old now, but they were looking at the use of peer counselors, and they framed it as sort of fictive kin, but they were looking at the use of peer counselors at the high school level in terms of sharing information and being able to help their peers get information about how to apply for financial aid and how to prepare for college. That may be one potential thing to think about here. I've also been thinking about, especially given my work with a center that is charged with looking at economic education, financial literacy, is whether or not an idea for action here is to model the work of some others and partner with child welfare offices to offer financial literacy workshops for middle school foster youth, and that also focus on paying for college. And I say not deficit oriented here, only to sort of point out that some of the financial literacy work that I have seen sort of really focuses on the individual and not the systemic issues and barriers that lower income people face. So affordability will continue to be a concern, and I certainly don't want to suggest that the affordability problem is an easy one to solve, but what can we actually do about that? And I think two things emerge here. I think the finding on merit aid really points to this idea that institutional financial aid policies and state financial aid policies really matter. They can have an impact on students. What we have seen at the institutional level and the state level is the shift toward merit-based or merit-only criteria in the awarding of grant aid at the institutional or state level. Perhaps we should swing the pendulum back a little bit more and make those merit programs need aware. And then finally, a big question I have here is whether or not the former foster youth in this sample and in general are able to gain access to education and training vouchers. Do they have knowledge about that? So with that, I think I will turn it back over to Amy and can have some discussion, dialogue, and questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jacob, for your presentation. I'd like to ask for people, if you have questions, please go ahead and type those into the chat box or send me an email, and I will keep my eye on those. So the first question that we have is, has the study been published, and what's the name of the article?
Good question. So no, this has not been published. I'm happy if folks contact me to share this. So what I'm presenting today is from a book chapter in a book that I've done with some colleagues that may be coming out at the end of the year. But I'll just say I'm happy to share the book chapter with folks if you just email me.
Okay, great. Thank you. And another question that we have is, what additional data do you feel like, or do you think would be helpful to better understand youth in foster care and their experiences of financial aid?
Yeah, so I don't think I really drove the point home, but all the students that I'm talking about, these are students that are already enrolled in post-secondary education. And so these aren't, we're not looking at the effects of financial aid, or I'm not able to look at the effects of financial aid on high school students. And we know that behaviors around preparing for an opportunity to prepare for college, those begin very early and are related to financial aid as early, perhaps as middle school. So the kind of information, the data I think would be really helpful to all of us would be to have some information about students' awareness of how they can pay for college as early as the 9th grade, and maybe to have another data point from them in the 11th or 12th grade to get a sense of what they're doing, what steps they're taking to perhaps apply for financial aid, what supports they have, and then to be able to tie that to whether they go to college and their use of financial aid in college. I think that there are a lot of data points that I think would be very helpful, but I think that's one that would be extremely helpful to start with.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question is if people are interested, for example, if they work at colleges or something and they want to see how things are happening for local students, are you aware of data sources that colleges themselves might have, that programs might be able to look at to understand what their students are experiencing?
That is a really good question, and I wish maybe other folks will have a better answer to that. I wish there were a good, straightforward answer. I think a couple of things. One is that generally institutions, from what I have read and what I understand, institutions do not have great abilities to identify youth who may have been in foster care. For various reasons. And so it would, I think at the institutional level, be hard for the average person to go in and say, hey, could you tell me a little bit about how our former foster youth at our university are utilizing financial aid or other financial supports to get through college. I think that would be challenging. I think an approximation of that would be financial aid offices generally participate in outreach programs to local high schools or to community groups. College Goal Sunday I forget when it is. It's coming up, but it's typically it's a national day where financial aid offices all over the country create opportunities to educate kids in high school, youth in high school about financial aid opportunities. And so I could envision you just go to your financial aid office and ask someone there, what do you do for College Goal Sunday? Do you include outreach to former foster youth? Are you working with former foster youth on campus? And just start a conversation with them. I think that would probably be one of the most effective ways to get a sense of what is happening at your institution.
Right. I wanted to open, since Jake, a couple of times you said that, having people kind of talk a little bit about if they've had experiences with this, things maybe that they've done at their own institution. So if you have anything that you'd like to share with a group, something that you've done before, I think there's a little raise your hand. You should be able to see a raise your hand button on the chat window. So if any of you would like to raise your hand, and then I can unmute you to give you an opportunity to share something that you've tried or at your own schools. Oh, and I did just get a question by email. So sorry, trying to do a couple of things at once. Okay, so the question I just got by email is, were you able to look at the former foster youth with financial aid and see what % of their income they pay towards tuition as compared to those former foster youth who don't have financial aid?
So what the proportion of former foster youth, the proportion of their income that goes to tuition for those that received aid versus those that did not receive aid?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
No, I didn't look at that specifically. I mean, I think one of and I think one of the questions I would have in particular is you really want to dig into why someone was not receiving financial aid, because within that group, you would have folks that may not have been aware of financial aid but had high financial need, and those that may have had high awareness of financial aid but had no financial need. But I think you could dig in there. The other dig in there and look at that question a little more specifically. I think the other thing in terms of next steps on this to tease out would be to look at tuition fees and other expenses. Tuition and fees, keep in mind, only make up, depending on the institution, anywhere from maybe 50 to 70% of the total cost of attendance. And so that would be something to look at as well.
Right. Okay, well, I haven't received any other questions, so I think maybe we'll wrap up at this point. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you again, Jake, for your presentation. And again, as I said at the beginning, we will be posting this recording as well as the PowerPoint on our website soon. So thank you so much, and please be sure to register for our future webinars if they're on topics that you're interested in. Thank you.